Hello, everyone. As we begin this program, I'll make a few announcements prior to the introduction of our speaker. But I do want to welcome you all as John continues to let people in from the waiting room. And first of all, say Da Jia Hao. I am Jim Mockford, the president of Northwest China Council. And I want to thank our executive director, John Wong, for helping coordinate and produce this event today. The Northwest China Council was established in 1980 after nearly 50 years of isolation with China. We began to promote events thanks to a grant from the Asia Society in New York. And that was as a non-political nonprofit organization to promote a greater understanding of China, Chinese history, culture, business, and contemporary relations with the United States. Today, as we are now in our 43rd year, we face the challenges of coming out of the isolation of a pandemic. But thanks to Zoom, among the new technologies of online connectivity, we've been able to offer education and engagement on the issues that we face today. I want to let you know that this is being recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel for viewing if you have to leave early or have friends that you'd like to share this chat with afterwards. And that will be posted sometime soon. And that you're all muted by automatically when you join us, but please enter any questions at any time by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time for some questions after the program. I do want to thank World Oregon, Derek Olson and Tim DeRoche, who are here with us, and the members of World Oregon who are joining us today. And we hope you'll come back for other programs of the Northwest China Council, and I certainly recommend World Oregon to our members as well. So with that, as people continue to come in, I do want to start our introduction anyway and introduce our guest, Professor Stephen Harnett, who's joining us today from Denver, where he's professor and director of undergraduate studies in the communication department of the University of Colorado at Denver. And in our recent newsletter and program announcement, we mentioned some of his bio. I won't get into all of it because we do want to get on with the talk as soon as possible. But he was president of the National Communication Association. And of course, we caught your attention by mentioning his recent book, A World of Turmoil, the United States, China, and Taiwan in the Cold War. And I will put another link to where you can get this book in our chat line, but you should be able to find it simply by Googling it or looking on Amazon, as well as the Michigan State University Press. And so please feel free to pursue this conversation after you've read the book if you haven't read so already. And we'll have some opportunities to do that because we continue to have book talks throughout the year. A few years ago, I happened to attend the production of the University of Hawaii at Manoa Paul Chung Memorial Conference, where I first heard Professor Harnett speak, as well as Dr. Chao-Ning Su, who was our speaker last year in this China Chat series. And her talk is also available on our YouTube channel at northwestchina.org. And continuing on, in preparation for these talks, I looked at the University of Denver's website and also the Oakland universities. And I want to comment that both universities are well on their way to producing future speakers among their students who are continuing to do really interesting things connected with the story of China and Taiwan and the engagement with the United States. So at this time, I would like to hand the mic over. I will turn off my video and let Professor Harnett begin his remarks as we approach the 5 minutes after the hour, and we'll come back in about 40 minutes to talk to you all with questions and any comments you would like to make at that time. Professor Harnett, take it away.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tim and Derek from World Oregon. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stephen Harnett from the University of Colorado. It's a terrific honor to get to spend some time with you this afternoon. The title of the talk is A World of Turmoil, the United States, China, and Taiwan in the Long Cold War. And I should say that it is a perilous endeavor to try to take a 350-page book and condense it into a quick 30-minute talk. So forgive me if I try to cover a lot of territory quickly. And just for reference, a world of turmoil, that's a great quotation from President Eisenhower, who was referring to the world at the time that he was inaugurated as president, saying it's a world of turmoil, the wheels are coming off. And when he said that, he meant specifically because of situations in the Taiwan Strait between China and Taiwan. So my book begins then in 1950 and walks us up to the present. So what I want to do today, you can see here there's a little outline of the talk on the side. I just want to try to do 5 quick things. I want to review the recent past, talk about this idea of a new Cold War, and then I want to walk you through the different constructions of one China thinking, which I think is really kind of the root of our current tensions in that part of the world. And then I want to talk about a shift in Chinese political discourse, moving from traumatized nationalism to wolf warrior discourse. And I'm going to end with questions. And so as a good teacher, my goal here today is not to persuade you that I have answers to anything. I just want to try to ask good questions to spur conversation for all of us so that we can collectively try to move our knowledge forward. And you can see a beginning there with a slide on the screen of the spy balloon with the Statue of Liberty. Look at her eyes kind of looking sideways there at that spy balloon. But let's talk now. Let's move to the first part of the talk, and let's talk about the recent past and what's going on between the US, China, and Taiwan. I want to begin by going back to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei this past August. And there's the picture of Pelosi and President Tsai waving to the cameras. And I've given you 2 quotes on the left side of the screen, one from Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. He described Pelosi's visit as utterly reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible. He didn't want to escalate tensions with China, and he didn't want us to start a 2-front war, right? We're already tangling with Russia and Ukraine. He didn't think Pelosi should go to Taiwan because he didn't want to problematize the situation in Ukraine. Now, at the same time, Mei Sing-tang in the Taipei Times said Pelosi's visit showed true courage. And I think in the US, if you read the press, if you watch the news, overwhelming response from Americans was that we supported Pelosi's visit in a bipartisan manner, not necessarily because people agree with Pelosi, but because everyone was so angry at China's militarized response to the visit. And to show you just what that looked like visually, at the time of Pelosi's visit, the PRC responded with a brutal propaganda campaign across all platforms, radio, television, print media. And in the top left, you see a image that was circulating, that's from China Daily, of Nancy Pelosi taking a bite out of Taiwan independence and losing a front tooth. And in the bottom image, you see Pelosi in self-righteous fury with her eyes closed, carrying the Torch of Liberty from the Statue of Liberty, but it looks like it's about to ignite the little bundle of dynamite that she's holding in her arms. So it shows Pelosi as a self-righteous and destructive fool. And what's really interesting here is the depiction of President Tsai. You see her rolling out the carpet for Pelosi, calling her excellency, and you see those little sweat marks coming out of her. That's how the Communist Party tends to portray President Tsai, as kind of a sweating munchkin, a little elf serving the empire. And these are just 2 examples of the kind of representations the Communist Party was producing at this time. While they did that, they were firing missiles into the South China Sea. They were firing missiles into Japanese territorial waters. For the first time, they fired missiles that actually flew over the island of Taiwan and into the waters east of the island. Their aircrafts were crossing the median line into Taiwanese airspace. Their ships were encircling the island. And I've given you a quote there from China Daily saying Pelosi's visit was an example of China bashing, increasing the possibility of war. And it was so tense. I mean, if you go back to August, it was so tense that people were wondering, like, oh my gosh, are we going to go to war over this? At the same time, here's where it gets really interesting. China has always assumed if it ratchets up the bluster and the anger, that can intimidate Taiwan into compliance. And of course, that's never happened. They also seem to think they can intimidate the US into compliance. And what's interesting is following Pelosi's visit, and then following this avalanche of anti-Pelosi propaganda produced by the party, we get Joe Biden. Here's the still of him on 60 Minutes. This is now in September. And the reporter asks President Biden, will we go in to defend Taiwan, or like we're doing in Ukraine, will we kind of be hands off? And President Biden says, yes. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't flinch. He says, we will defend Taiwan. Now, for those of you who have been following our three-way relationship since the end of World War I, the U.S. position has always been based on what people call strategic ambiguity, meaning maybe we'll go in, maybe we won't go in. And the thinking was that if we left our options open and our response ambiguous, that would leave China kind of in an uncertain status as to what they wanted to do. President Biden has reversed that. And President Biden now on 4 different occasions has said, yes, we will defend Taiwan if China invades. And if you want to see the references there on the bottom of the screen, I've given you the places you can go find that. This is really significant, though, because it shows that every time China ratchets up the intimidation, both Taiwan and the U.S. resist that intimidation. And so that's where we are right now in terms of what the recent past has been. We've got Pelosi going, knowing, here's the key thing, Pelosi goes to Taiwan, knowing her doing so will provoke the Communist Party. You have to assume that she knows the Communist Party will overreact, and doing so will draw lines of clarity for the American public. And that's exactly what happened. Even Republicans, they might have hated Nancy Pelosi, but Republicans were more angry at China's response. And that leads to the kind of thing you see President Biden saying that, yeah, we're going to defend Taiwan. You bet we are. No ambiguity, flat out, yes, we will defend. Now, here's where Biden's clarity is interesting. Let's go back just another step back in U.S. history, and let's talk about the Trump presidency. And on the left of the screen, you see a picture of Donald Trump as a kind of spoiled little child sitting on a box of explosives playing with matches. If you read the Chinese press, this kind of depiction took place virtually every day for the 4 years of the Trump presidency. Depictions of Trump as a child playing with matches, basically setting the world on fire and not even realizing what he was doing. And I've given you a list of quotes on the screen, different depictions of what Trump's presidency meant for China and U.S. relations. And the question is, did Trump's attempt to blow up the status quo play into the hands of Russia and China? And certainly his kind of shambolic and chaotic governing strategy confirmed the Communist Party's belief that democracy is little more than chaos. So that's the kind of situation that Biden felt like he had to clean up. But while Trump was behaving like a child, playing with matches, serious people in America, in a bipartisan manner, were arriving at roughly the same conclusions as Trump. And this is now where it gets really interesting. I'm going to give you here a long quotation on the screen. You could take a moment to read that. That's from a speech that Vice President Mike Pence gave at the Hudson Institute. And this is considered one of Pence's only major policy speeches, but it's also going to go down in history as one of the key turning points in the 21st century, because this was when Pence, not playing with matches, not being a child, this is when Pence, as a sober and concerned and fact-based adult, laid out the case against China. And what's interesting to know is that everything Pence said has become bipartisan consensus. That's what's really interesting. And at the bottom of the screen, you see a line there from Robert Kaplan saying, a new Cold War has begun. And it's begun, if you look now back at the Pence quotation, it's begun because America has reached a point of bipartisan, across-the-board frustration. We thought China joining the WTO would help democratize. We thought if we opened our markets to Chinese goods, they would open their market to our goods. That hasn't happened. We thought if we opened our financial institutions to Chinese investors, they would do the same for us. That has not happened. So instead of there being a mutually reciprocal relationship leading to the liberalizing of markets and the opening up of cultural boundaries, the exact opposite has happened. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you're frustrated. And that's what Pence was pointing out. And look at the last line of his quote. He says that hope has gone unfulfilled. And so what's important to know in terms of U.S.-China-Taiwan relations is that while Trump is behaving like a child and lighting matches, Pence and other serious people share his frustration. And then Biden, you see now more recently coming out and says, yeah, well, we're going to defend Taiwan. And so what you see is that, strangely enough, Biden's foreign policy vis-a-vis China is essentially continuing Trump's foreign policy, both of them based on frustration with where China is at. So the question then is, why are we so frustrated with each other? Why is China so mad at America? Why is America so mad at China? Why is Taiwan stuck in the middle of us? What is the foundation of this misunderstanding? And that's really what my book is about, is trying to historically track the roots of our mutually antagonistic misunderstanding with each other. And I think the way we can make sense of this is to go back to what now people call the one China policy. And what's interesting about the one China policy is there's not one China policy, there's 9. So let me lay out for you the 9 different versions of one China, all of which conflict with the others. All right, so here on the first slide, I'm giving you the one China debate from the PRC version, the People's Republic of China version. And it's important to know that one China thinking goes through 3 phases. The first phase is what I'm going to call the revolutionary version. And I've given you on the screen a quotation from Chairman Mao in 1936. He was talking to the great American journalist Edgar Snow, in which he says the function of communist China is to liberate the former colonized world. And when Snow said, does that include Taiwan? Mao said, yeah, the same thing applies for Taiwan. So in its initial revolutionary version, when Mao thought of China, he thought of it as an engine of liberation, an anti-colonial force for good. Now, once China after World War II started to consolidate the nation state, right? First, it went into Taiwan in 1951. Then it went farther west into what we now call Xinjiang. You know, there's been tensions, of course, around Mongolia ever since then. Hong Kong's in play. Taiwan has always been in play, and so on. So by 1971, when the US began to think about trying to reopen negotiations with China, Zhou Enlai says to Henry Kissinger that Taiwan, solving the Taiwan issue, is the first thing they want to do, and the way that we'll get there is by the US pulling out of Taiwan. So in 1936, China is a anti-colonial and liberatory engine of freedom. By early 1970s, it's a nation formating state that wants to absorb other things, whether it's Taiwan, Xinjiang, Taiwan. And now we have the Xi era version. And I've given you 3 rather alarming quotations from PLA personnel. This is from a panel discussion in Beijing. And look at the quotations. The PLA is capable of taking Taiwan within 100 hours. Right? So we're talking about a 3-4 day war. Another commander said it's time for the PLA to deploy troops. So one China now means the exact opposite of one China, what one China meant in 1936. So even within Chinese contemporary history, you have these 3 different understandings of China's role in the world stage and what one China means in terms of a phrase describing that nation state. Now, Taiwan has also had 3 versions, also internally contradictory. Those of you who know your history will remember that when Chiang Kai-shek was chased off the mainland and went to the island of Formosa, one of the ways he justified his ongoing regime was through the trope of returning to the mainland. And there's great stories of nationalist officers meeting in Washington, D.C. with Senator McCarthy and other right-wing leaders in America. And they would end their dinner parties by chanting, "Back to the mainland, back to the mainland." And what that meant at the time was that Chiang Kai-shek thought there was only one China, but it was his China. It was not communist China. So if you were a Taiwanese official, or if you were a KMT official and you said one China, it meant nationalist KMT reinvading the mainland to overthrow the communists. Now that version of one China began to change in the 70s, the election of Lee Teng-hui, first elected president of Taiwan. And he had a super cool version of one China, where he said, look at that middle quotation, when China becomes free and democratic and has social justice, then we'll have unification. So in Lee's version, what he says is like, yeah, you guys are totalitarians, we're Democrats. We can't talk about uniting under one China until you become a democracy. And so what he was basically saying is, Chiang Kai-shek said we were going to conquer you militarily. I'm predicting that we're going to conquer you with our ideas, with our soft power, with the allure of democracy. And now we have a third version today under the leadership of the DPP and President Tsai. And I've given you here a long quotation from a DPP resolution regarding Taiwan's future. And look at they say that number one, Taiwan is a sovereign and independent country. So no, we're not a part of China. At 3, Taiwan should expand its role in the international community. And 4, Taiwan should renounce the one China position. So the DPP has completely reversed course. They no longer want to take over the mainland, as Chiang Kai-shek did. And they no longer really have any hopes for democratizing China, as Lee did. And now they just say, we're an independent entity. We're going to focus on our own democracy. You're China, we're Taiwan. Now, the US has also had multiple versions of one China. And on the right, I've given you an image of President Nixon and Henry Kissinger taking a boat to China in 1971. That visit resulted in the 1972 Shanghai Communique. That's basically the foundation of our modern understanding. And what's interesting is in this document, we outline a version of US-Chinese relations that are completely ambiguous. So look at the first line I've given you there on the screen. The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. Now notice in that sentence does not say America believes these things. What it says is we acknowledge the Chinese believe these things. So this is not a statement about what America will do or promises to do. This is just an observation. Look at the second line. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question. What that means is no matter what happens between China and Taiwan, there can be no military force employed. So we will support resolution, but it can't be war. Third line, it, meaning the US, affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal of all US forces and military installations from Taiwan. Now, the key word there is ultimate, right? So what that says is we'll try to demilitarize the region someday, not now, depending on other variables, depending on other conditions. And look again at the fourth line. In the meantime, it will progressively reduce its forces and military installations on Taiwan as the tension in the area diminishes. Now, this is written in the midst of the Vietnam War, but what it does is it gives America the permanent right to say, well, we want to demilitarize, but the situation in the region does not permit us. Now, if you talk to Chinese officials, or if you read Chinese media, they think the 1972 Shanghai Communique outlined a version of one China commensurate with China's wishes. What I'm showing you here, just by looking at the text, is that's not correct. The Shanghai Communique agrees to nothing and gives America the permanent right to do what it wants in the region. In his memoir called White House Years, Henry Kissinger called this his theory of abeyance, meaning kick the can down the road, do nothing now, make no promises, and see how history shakes out. So let's, by way of review, on this screen, you see that there are 3 different historical versions of thinking about China within China. On this screen, you see there's 3 different versions of thinking about China from Taiwan's perspective. And on this screen, you see that America's thinking is just a blank slate of confusion and contradiction. So what this means is that every time the US, Taiwan, and China start debating about what to do in the Taiwan Strait, we're all coming at it from these different perspectives, these different understandings. It's a recipe for perpetual misunderstanding. Now, let's jump forward and let's ask, what is the consequence of this perpetual mishmash of misunderstanding? And what I would say is that it has created in the popular mind in China what I like to call traumatized nationalism. And traumatized nationalism is a kind of thinking that privileges a sense of grievance, a sense of anger, a sense that you have been wronged by history and that you must right this past wrong. And I've given you on the screen now a series of examples. Chairman Mao says it in 1949. Chao says it in 54. Jiang Zemin says it in 71. And I've given you a recent example from Xi Jinping saying Chinese history is a history of imperialist oppression, humiliation, and suffering. It's intriguing to think that this has become a kind of central rhetorical platform within contemporary Chinese culture. And what it does is it creates the need to right some perceived wrong from the past. And I bet many of you at this point are thinking, gosh, that sounds a lot like Trump, doesn't it? That sounds a lot like Make America Great Again, because Trump is also a raconteur of grievance politics. And so what's interesting in our relations is to think that Trump's sense of grievances actually mirror Xi's sense of grievances. Both Trump and Xi produce this traumatized nationalism. Now, here's the problem for us. What's happened in contemporary Chinese discourse is traumatized nationalism has given way to a form of discourse called wolf warriors. And the wolf warriors don't want to negotiate. They don't want to compromise. They just want to fight. And here's a great political cartoon by Rebel Pepper. Some of you may know Rebel Pepper. He's one of our really great political commentators, showing Xi Jinping in an imperial chariot throwing little bombs of COVID over his shoulder as the wolves of war drag him into the future. So it's a very provocative cartoon. But look at the quotations on the left. The quotations on the left indicate that the cartoon is probably more accurate and factual than I think any of us would like to admit. The Global Times says, in the face of collective malicious attacks from Western countries, no sovereign country with dignity would back down. So you take the anger and the grievance of traumatized nationalism, you convert that into a sense of let's fight because we're not backing down. We have dignity, we won't back down. China Daily says China will not accept accusations about Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or Taiwan lying down. So these guys are ready for a fight. And China's ambassador to Great Britain, Liu Xiaoming, says we encourage diplomats to actively fight. So take the traumatized nationalism, the sense of grievance, the sense of injury, a lot of that produced by our misunderstandings over one China and Taiwan, turn that into a willingness to fight and to be aggressive. And that's what you get with wolf warrior rhetoric. The way I like to think of wolf warrior rhetoric is it's traumatized nationalism weaponized for contemporary purposes. And now it's really interesting. I'm sure you've probably all seen this in your own daily lives and your conversations with friends and the way that you consume media, is that this wolf warrior rhetoric is profoundly unproductive. So here's a chart on the left. This is a study done by the Pew Research Center. The red dot indicates levels of confidence in Xi Jinping. The blue dot indicates levels of confidence in Joe Biden. And what you'll see starting in Sweden, where the gap between the two is 73 percentage points, you'll see that in every country they surveyed, except for Singapore, the Biden administration has a magnificent public polling lead over Xi Jinping. And that's because no one wants to be bullied. No one wants to be threatened. Aggressive rhetoric virtually never works. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking to your kids or your wife or your employees or your neighbors, being aggressive and bullying always backfires. Shui-Sang Zhao, a colleague of mine here in Denver, editor of the Journal of Contemporary China, has a great line in which he says, China's diplomacy lacks contemporary moral appeal because there's no sugar in the appeal. It's all stick, right? It's all bullying. It's all wolf warrior rhetoric. And the question is, we've got that on this. Common sense tells us it doesn't work. Why are they doing it? And here's where I start to get scared. I would argue that what's happened in China over the past 10 or 15 years is we're seeing an emerging legitimacy crisis for the state. We have economic stagnation. COVID has been a disaster. environmental crisis in China is just overwhelming. We have a housing crisis, escalating political repression. I actually think that the Communist Party is teetering on the brink of what sociologists call a legitimacy crisis. Communism used to be the glue that held the place together, and no one believes communism anymore. They used to believe in capitalism, but as the state controls the market, that also is kind of losing its impetus. And so what we see is Xi Jinping is turning to nationalism as the ideological glue to hold the place together. So as the legitimacy crisis ramps up, he ramps up the nationalism. They kind of go hand in hand. Nicholas Kohler, the great observer of China, said this is a testimony before Congress, and he said, China is conducting conducting domestic propaganda by conducting foreign propaganda. And the idea here is that Xi Jinping can look like a tough guy at home by talking hard against Taiwan, by talking hard against America or Britain, whoever it is. And in fact, on the left now, you see that's an image from London of Chinese expats in London taking their pro-China message to the streets of London. So the allure of nationalism is strong for young Chinese people. It's productive for Xi Jinping in terms of kind of holding the state together and appearing like a tough guy leader of an emerging great power. The problem is that if you talk about nationalism again and again and again, if you push wolf warrior rhetoric again and again and again, and you don't act on it, then do you start to look like a hypocrite? And this is exactly what happened to Donald Trump, right? He talks tough all the time, but accomplishes nothing. So he lost credibility. We're going to see this start to happen with Xi Jinping. And so what scares me is, will Xi Jinping, in order to live up to the tough guy wolf warrior rhetoric, will he need to invade Taiwan to live up to the promises he's made to the people? Or can he deploy nationalism but not act on nationalism? And I don't know, I don't have an answer to that question, but it's a very dangerous game to play, right? He's walking on a tightrope, and if he falls off in either direction, it's going to be either revolution in China or war abroad. So it's a terrifying dilemma to have put himself in. So let me end by asking you 9 questions. In terms of what's going to happen in China, will we see Xi dial down the wolf warrior rhetoric, or is he going to go even harder at it? Can the CPC as a party, as an organization, can it transcend traumatized nationalism to become something more like a mature, reasonable player? This is what America has wanted all along. We want a partner, but we need a partner who's going to honor international law. So can it become a mature power rather than a kind of childish power? And in China, will domestic nationalism drive foreign policy extremism? I think how you answer that question will determine the future of peace in Asia. If we look at the international level, does Putin's folly in Ukraine deter China from invading Taiwan? I was just in Taiwan recently. Everybody there was watching Ukraine with great interest, and everyone hoping is, as Putin sees that he cannot take Ukraine easily, that the Ukrainians will fight for every inch. Is that making Xi Jinping think twice as well? Because we know the Taiwanese will fight just as hard as the Ukrainians. So is Ukraine deterring China from invading Taiwan? The other question is, do Biden's repeated warnings saying, yes, we will defend Taiwan, having removed the ambiguity and having now gone for certainty, yes, we will defend Taiwan, has that deterred Xi Jinping? And even if you say it has, the question then is, well, what happens after the election in 2024? I mean, oh my God, what happens to U.S. foreign policy if Trump gets back in the White House, or if DeSantis gets in the White House? I don't think either of them will pursue Biden's policies in terms of defending Taiwan. And the third question on an international front is, can regional democracies rise to Taiwan's support? Could we see a more robust defense of Taiwan from Japan, from Australia, the so-called Quad? Where's India going to go on this? And then questions for Taiwan. I think there's 3 really pressing questions. I think Tsai Ing-wen has just been an amazing president. She's a fantastic public speaker. She's been a masterful communicator, threading the needle between endorsing her country's sovereignty but not provoking China. But we've got a presidential election coming up, and we don't know who her successor will be. So we really don't know what the future of Taiwanese political rhetoric will look like vis-a-vis China. So that's a big question mark coming down the road. Second question is, will Taiwan's thriving democracy lure more allies? You know, what I love about Taiwan is it's just a robust, rich, rollicking democracy, right? They've got a crazy free press. They've got all these great NGOs and civic institutions. I mean, it's really just a laboratory for all the things that can go wrong and right about democracy. And does that make them a more alluring ally for others? I certainly hope so. It's certainly why I love Taiwan. And then the third question is, will Taiwan's military budget rise to meet threats? Taiwan's percentage of military spending comparative to GDP is still relatively low. It's got to rise. The question is, can they raise their military budget without provoking China? So we've got a series of questions for China, questions for the international community, questions for Taiwan. I don't have answers to any of them, but I do want to go back to this idea that we won't get productive and mutually enriching answers unless we can figure out a way to move past the 9 different versions of one China. That, for me, is the foundation of our misunderstanding. That's where we need to go if we want to create a culture of peace and understanding. Now, I've tried in 30 minutes to condense a gigantic book, so forgive me if I feel like I've given you quick answers. Maybe during Q&A, we can follow up on the details if people want to follow up. But that's basically what I wanted to share with you today. And so I say thank you. I'm going to turn the floor back to Jim, and we can start looking at questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really great. And I'm going to use my executive privilege here to ask a question.
Okay.
And bring it back to your book, because you mentioned that President Tsai is a masterful communicator. And also, I want to ask, in contrast to the Wolf Warrior sort of thing that's happened more recently, you mentioned towards the end of your book, you quote our former U.S. ambassador, John Leighton Stewart, right towards the end of your book. There's a great quote. I'm wondering, do we have examples today of diplomats speaking diplomatically, and do American ambassadors have garner any attention in China or even in the United States, unless they're approaching some sort of rhetoric that's, hyperactive? We don't have, that I know of, more recent quotes. You have to go back to your quote here at the end of your book, which is an ambassador, that was in place at the end of World War II, right? For a good quote that John Leighton Stewart, America's World War II era ambassador to China, about ideals and, democracy. So I thought while people are entering their comments and chat questions, ask you about that, about examples of diplomats speaking diplomatically on either side of the fence.
That's a great question, Jim. And it really gets to the heart of the matter that certainly under the Trump administration, I think most of your participants today will know that the Trump administration State Department was just demolished, right? But by the time he left the White House, there was something like 165 top State Department posts that had not been filled. So not only were there not eloquent diplomats, Jim, there weren't diplomats. Biden is now trying to restaff the State Department, trying to rebuild that culture. The problem is the young people who are now coming into work for the State Department have not really experienced bipartisan and mutually satisfying discourse between our countries. There's not really much of a legacy of that, right? And so by way of example, think about Secretary of State Blinken. The first thing he did when he was appointed Secretary of State is he held a high-level international summit with China in Anchorage. This was the famous Anchorage summit. And some of you may remember that when Secretary Blinken opened the session, instead of saying, thank you to our colleagues from China, thank you for coming, welcome to America, we honor your country, we honor your culture, let's build roads to peace. No, what did Blinken do? He ripped them. For like 10 minutes, Blinken just assaulted them on what they had done in Hong Kong, what they were doing in Xinjiang, what they're doing in Taiwan. Now, you can do that behind closed doors, but you don't do that in front of the cameras. So within the very first 10 minutes that the Biden administration for the very first time was meeting their Chinese counterparts, we dropped the hammer on them, and it's gone sour since then. So, Jim, are there positive examples today? No, there are not, and that's a shame, and that's on us, and that's why America shares the blame for where we are now.
Okay, thank you so much. That wasn't the answer I wanted to hear, but but it looks like that's the situation we're in, and that's also where I hope organizations like Northwest China Council and others can take a part in expanding our dialogue, so that we can have, what didn't happen at Anchorage, happen going forward.
Jim, I mean, I'm so glad you said that. I've spent the past 10 years organizing multinational conferences in China, bringing scholars together. We've hosted over 600 scholars from 24 countries at events in China. And what happens at every one of these events is the Americans say, we love China, we love democracy, let's find a way to work together. And boy, isn't our leadership terrible? And I'll tell you what, all of our Chinese scholars say the same thing. They all say, yeah, our leadership is terrible too. And what can we as scholars and activists and civic leaders do to build those bridges? So I think what Northwest China Council is doing, I think what World Oregon is doing, I really think our governments are so bad across the board that it's up to us as citizens to try to fix this problem.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. I'll start with Mike Roberts. He asked the question, what key factors, including timing, would trigger an invasion of Taiwan by China?
Okay, well, Mike, that's a great question. I mean, China, here's the funny thing is China has always said, if Taiwan declares independence, we will invade. And the Taiwanese for 50 years have said, dude, we're already independent. Like, don't ask us to declare it. It's already an established fact. So China has this red line, but it's kind of a fake red line. So that's one thing. I think the election in 2024 is going to be very significant. There are candidates who have a record of being more aggressive about Taiwanese independence. So the 2024 election could be really interesting in terms of timing. I think the other question is what's going to happen in China domestically. People were calling it the blank paper revolution, right? I think if we see more of that, if we see more street action, if we see more protest, I think that's likely to push the party closer to invasion. Now, on the flip side of that, the more America can ratchet up its deterrence capabilities and the more Taiwan can ratchet up its deterrence capabilities, the more support we get from Japan and India and Australia, that pushes back the timeline for invasion. So I don't think this is written in stone. I think there's literally hundreds of variables at play. Here's the final thing I'll say, Mike, to answer your question. We knew Ukraine was going to be invaded by Russia 9 months before they invaded. Now, of course, the White House was foolish and didn't take the intelligence for what it is. But to wage a major international war is a logistical nightmare. You need gasoline, troops, food, medical supplies, weapons. I mean, you name it. You can't stage a war in secret anymore because our satellites can see it. And I take solace in knowing that if, you can go to the CIA, they've got all kinds of updates on this. You can see the satellite imagery. We have no evidence that China is amassing fuel, weapons, none of the things you need for a war are being amassed on the coast of China. So at this point, we're relatively certain they are not invading and they're not planning to invade. So I realize I'm kind of ducking your question, Mike, but I'm just trying to, again, give you the sense of all the variables at play.
Stephen, I'll move on to the next question, which is from Jeffrey Kinkley, and he thanks you very much for your fascinating lecture. But his question is, in Trump versus Democrats, did we see a replay of the NATO creation loss of the China era of the late 40s, when the GOP was for defense, Asia first, and Democrats were for rebuilding Europe first? Okay, that's his first question. And then number two is, in traumatized nationalism, do you see a replay of the use of that kind of propaganda and education against evil Japan, which was made problematic by economic interconnections? And so is that much deeper with the US and China today?
Wow. All right. So So Jeff has just asked two questions that will both require a 16-week long answer. There, those are complicated questions, Jeff. Let me ask you this, answer the second one first. Traumatized nationalism can be deployed against any hated other. It can be deployed against the US, against Taiwan, it can be deployed against Japan, and so on. So it's a multivalent discourse of grievances. And I bet that some of our listeners today have probably been to the tremendous museum in downtown Nanking, right, where they depict the rape of Nanking. And that museum is living architectural embodiment of traumatized nationalism, in this case deployed against Japan. So Jeff, you're dead on, buddy. Traumatized nationalism can be used against anyone whom you want to depict as an enemy. Now, as for your first question, are we seeing a replay of political discourse from around the 50s? And oh yeah, you bet. And that's what my new book is about, is where the book that Jim showed you begins in 1950. And so, Jeff, to answer your question, I'm writing a new book that starts in 1945 and goes from 45 to 50. And what we see during that time in American discourse is the Republican Party held the platform of anti-communism, God, free markets, and fight anybody who messes with us, right? We want to fight war with China. I mean, the Republican Party was actively seeking war with China. The Democrats tried to walk a more balanced line. We wanted to rebuild Europe. We wanted to rebuild Asia as well, but we didn't want to go to war in Asia. So yeah, these debates, Jeff, between invest at home versus invest abroad, build peace via deterrence via build peace via wartime threats, those debates have just keep repeating over and over again. And the more you know about Senator Joe McCarthy from the 50s, I tell you this, he's a key part of my book, and everything Trump says sounds like McCarthy said it. It's really kind of frightening to think how similar the fear and loathing and hysteria of McCarthyism is to MAGA today. So yes, Jeff, I think you're right. I think we're seeing a repetition of that same kind of political discourse.
We're getting quite a few questions, so I don't know if we'll get through them all. However, I'm going to jump to a question from a former Book Talk China Chat presenter, Doug Palmer, who's the author of Bruce Lee, and he spoke for us last year about his book, and that's on our YouTube channel. So Doug asks you that you indicated we must move beyond the 9 different versions of one China policy in order to make progress. But for the US, how would it get beyond its strategic ambiguity in the short term without making things worse?
Yeah, Doug, that's the question, right? Is how do we uphold our principles and our values without antagonizing the Chinese? And I'm going to give you an example that I think is going to shock your listeners. I was doing a project on the Tiananmen Square massacre, and I was following the cables between George Bush the senior, and the Chinese leadership. And the Chinese leadership after Tiananmen Square massacre was kind of stunned by America's response. They didn't understand why we were so angry, right? And George Bush said, look, you got to understand that for us Americans, free speech, the right to vote, respect of who you worship and where you do your business, all the things that are in the Bill of Rights. George Bush said, those things for us are like a religion. They're not negotiable. They're the core of who we are. And we're not going to try to shove them down your throat. But you got to understand that it's who we are, and we're always going to fight for them. And I liked how basically what George Bush was saying, this is who we are, these are our values. We won't negotiate on our values on our turf, but we can negotiate on our values on your turf. And I'm not hearing that from America. What I've been hearing lately is like, here's the highway, take it or leave it. We want to convert you. We want regime change, and that's not going to work. But I would like to hear an American diplomat say, hell yeah, we believe in free speech and the right to vote and free markets and the right to worship. That's who we are. These are our commitments. They're not political commitments. They're damn near religious for us. But that doesn't mean we're going to shove them down your throat. And what I don't see happening between our two countries is a discourse that says, what are our values and where can they meet? Where can they grow? Where can they maybe not grow? So I think, Doug, that's a great question. That right now we don't have a language that lets us get past that impasse without being escalatory. But I think there is one, and oddly enough, I think George Bush Sr. tried to plot it out for us way back in 1989.
Super. I have a question from Gabriel Z, who asks, if China had been receiving benefits from WTO, trade with the US, general trade order. Sorry, my screen bumped a bit. What is going to change the mindset of traumatized nationalism?
Well, so here's the thing. So I should back up. I probably should have began the speech by saying this. So as a professor of communication, my belief is that the things we cherish and hold on to are taught to us, right? These things are not inherent. They're not God-given forms of knowledge. They're things that we absorb. So I just said, for example, for us Americans, the right to free speech is nearly religious. That's because we've been saying that to each other for 200 years, right? We've all persuaded each other that that's what we believe. Similar thing is happening in China with traumatized nationalism, where it's taught to the youth in school textbooks. It's the subject of songs and poems and speeches. It's become a kind of cultural discourse. So the question is, what would the Communist Party have to do to shift that discourse? So instead of saying we're a weak people who keep being invaded by stronger powers, oh, woe is me, what would it take for the Communist Party to teach its citizens to say, hey, you're strong, confident urbanites, you're cosmopolitan citizens, go forth and be brave in the world? It would require a shift in discourse. That is something that can be taught if the Chinese leadership wishes to teach it. So it goes back, at least not so much in the US case, but in the China case, these things usually are top down, right? They come from the party, they're directives from the party. So the party would have to see the logic in moving past traumatized nationalism. And this goes back to what Jim said. When we do these conferences, all of the Chinese intellectuals we meet understand that. They're all ready to make that shift. They want to make that shift. They just feel like they're being held back by the party. It's not the people who so much are stuck in this. It's the party that's stuck in this. So what we really need is a kind of shift in mentality amongst the party leadership.
That's really interesting. I spent some time in Japan in the 1980s when Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone kind of stepped forward to talk about Japan as a proud country, that they had recovered from World War II, that their economy was booming, and I think he was one of the first Japanese politicians I know of that kind of stepped out to look at Japan as more than just a country that had suffered from the loss they experienced in World War II and atomic bombings and all that. Nakasone really stepped forward kind of as a leader of Japanese pride, as far as I remember. And so that is interesting. You commented that the party is what's the mindset that's holding them back. The people might be ready for something new and different. I'm trying to get to the next question, of which there are several. Andy T asks, how do you see India acting, especially in light of the evidence on their alignments in the Ukraine conflict, the US tilt towards them to countervail China influence, quad the geopolitical realities of the Asia-Pacific region? So how do you see India acting?
Yeah, Andy, that's a great question. And, certainly ever since the end of World War II, India has been something of a wild card in the region, right? Will they be a Soviet client state? Will they be an independent state? Will they be a kind of soft ally with the US? I mean, Indian politics are always changing, right? And so it's hard to predict where India will go. Here's what we know, though, right? We know that India has a very long, very contested, and often violent border with China, right? So that's not helping their feeling about China. We also know that India is one of the world's largest manufacturers of pharmaceuticals. We know that the party feels threatened by that capacity, right? Because China wants to build its own indigenous pharmaceutical capacity. So we know that China feels threatened by the pharmaceuticals in India. We know that they're warring over the border. We also know that they're trying to build alliances. So India is a real wild card. I don't have a good answer for you, but I can tell you this: if I was Secretary Blinken, I'd basically be living in India right now, because if you can form an alliance with India, that changes the future of Asia, right? So I think India is the linchpin to where this goes, and I think America currently is misplaying. Now, here's the problem, though. I don't know, Andy, what your thoughts are about Mr. Modi. It's hard to form alliances with Hindu fascists, right? I mean, what he's doing domestically in India really crosses a line for me. He's taking that country way down the road away from democracy and into something that's much more like ethno-fascism. So the question is, we need them geopolitically, but can we stomach what they're doing domestically, politically? So I don't have a good question for you, Andy, but I think it's a key question, and I think you're right to raise it.
I have a couple of questions from Steve Feldman, who said he enjoyed the talk, but he wants to know, are you exaggerating traumatized nationalism? Is not the idea of communism still very strong with Xi and his group? Isn't he trying to rebuild the role of communism in China? And does this mean the end of strengthening the CPC, and the belief in communism? So there's another question, but I'll let you see if you understood that one first.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question, Steve. And I guess it's important to try to think about answering that question by knowing how much of our audience today has been to China and how much time folks have spent in China. And I don't know, again, about Steve and your time in China. You know, you walk down the streets in Shanghai and it's like, it looks like the Miracle Mile in Chicago. I mean, like, it's designer stores selling stuff you can't afford. And the streets are full of Porsches and Jaguars. And it's like, I mean, the cities in China, downtown Beijing, this is true in Shanghai, this is true in Qingdao. These are not communist. These are not communist cities. These are elite Manhattan-style elitist enclaves of play for sex, drugs, cars, designer handbags. I mean, it's kind of gross. I mean, I'm revealing my own politics here that I'm not a fan of that in America either. But so no, I mean, communism is kind of a joke in China right now, and nobody really believes it. What Xi and his elite friends believe in is authoritarianism. They believe in control by the CPC, but they haven't been communists for 30 years, and they're not communists now. So traumatized nationalism is a very kind of convenient way of rallying the masses. And again, if folks get the chance to go to Nanking to see the museum on the rape of Nanking, that's the best, most physically manifest version of what traumatized nationalism is. But I really do think it has become a kind of cultural dominant in China in a way that communism hasn't been, certainly since 1990. So I hope you don't think I'm exaggerating. I think if you get to walk down the streets of Shanghai at rush hour to Saturday night, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's the farthest thing from communism you can imagine.
We're getting close to 1 o'clock, so I do know that sometimes people on their lunch hour here, you're an hour ahead of us, but may drift off this conversation. I do want to say before we go, and we might have time for another question, that I do want to thank World Oregon, and please check out their website at worldoregon.org for their upcoming programs, as well as our website, northwestchina.org. We have an upcoming movie chat on March 27th after watching the film Electric Shadows, and that it is today is International Women's Day, I believe. So I should mention that May Nagai is speaking to the Oregon Historical Society about her book, The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes, Chinese Migration, and Global Politics. That is the second in the Mark O. Hatfield series of lectures presented by Oregon Historical Society, and that will be held on May 28th. And you can check that out at ohs.org. So we're very busy for the rest of the month, and I want to thank everyone here as 1 o'clock about approaches us. Do you have to go teach class, Stephen, or do you have time for another question or two?
I'm happy to talk.
But anyway, I do want to thank everyone, which is my custom to do before the hour hits. And thank you all, everyone, for joining us today. We will continue with some more questions that I pick up off of the Q&A line here. And one is another one from Mike Roberts. The USA is doing, what is it, $2 billion of business per day with China. Why would they jeopardize this to support Russia and the Ukraine invasion? I'm not quite sure. what the answer to that one is. So I guess it's, why would China jeopardize their business with us to support Russia?
Yeah, Mike, that's a great question. And I think a lot of analysts internationally are asking the same question. Like, China is getting rich by being a reasonable, reliable player in the global capitalist supply chain, right? Global capitalism has been very good for China. So why would they mess with that by backing Putin? It's a great question, Mike. And I've heard a couple different answers. So let me just, I'm not even sure if these are correct, but I'll share with you what I've read. And the one answer that's really interesting is that historically, right, if you go all the way back to the end of World War II, there's always been this terrific tension between Russia and China. And certainly, you've all probably heard the story of the first time Chairman Mao went to Moscow and Joseph Stalin treated him like his pet dog, right? I mean, Stalin just insulted Mao, treated him like a junior partner. And Soviet Russia wanted to treat China as a client state. I've read a number of people saying, isn't it sweet for China to get to reverse that equation now, that they want to treat Russia like a client state? Like, so there's a sense of historical comeuppance. There's a sense that, I mean, as I assume as all of our listeners know, Russia is the largest manufacturer of oil and natural gas in that part of the world. China has virtually no indigenous oil and natural gas production. So China needs energy from Russia. So one answer is it's a kind of sweet historical revenge. One answer is that they just need the natural gas and the oil. I don't know if either one is right, but Mike, I like you, I find myself going like, my God, they're playing with fire. If they mess up the international markets, they're going to get hurt a lot more than the rest of us. So I think, if I understand your question, Mike, I think China's support for Russia is based on a fundamentally illogical proposition.
And moving on to Lisa Irving's question, she has, what questions do you have for the U.S. policy towards China in the long Cold War? But how should the U.S. build a partnership with the PRC in the future?
That's a great question, Lisa. And I think there are so many things that we and China agree on. And I'm always kind of stunned that we begin our conversations with China on the things that we disagree on. That just seems like silly diplomacy. So we have a shared interest in combating COVID and other pandemics. We have a shared interest in combating piracy on the high seas. We have a shared interest. I mean, drug war is a bad phrase because in America, it's been a disaster, but we do have a shared interest in trying to limit the flow of international narcotics. We have a shared interest in ending the trafficking in young women across borders into international prostitution. I mean, I could go on and on. There's like 50 things that we and China see eye to eye on. So let's build our relationship around all the things that we say yes on. And the thinking would be that if we say yes to each other 50 times, and by the time we get around to talking about human rights, maybe at least there'll be some trust and there'll be a history of learning how to speak with each other. So, the first rule of negotiation is you start with yes, you do the easy things first, you do the hard things later. Neither country is doing that now. It's just completely illogical. So Lisa, I do think there's a lot we can agree on, and we should start working there first.
Excuse me, Stephen, I'm getting a little bit of a workout on reading all these questions. Here's another one from Andy T. Is how do you see the dynamics between Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang playing out, given their respective and intertwined biographies?
Oh boy, that's you're really getting into some insider baseball there when you start talking about what are the relationships within the Politburo and the Standing Committee and who's in favor and who's not in favor. I would say that what we have learned about Xi Jinping, again, it's not so dissimilar from Donald Trump, is that he's the boss. You support the boss or you're gone. So in terms of their relationship, I know there's a long history there, but it's clear who's the driver. It's clear who could end the relationship. So, I mean, I don't have a good answer to this question. I think it's an interesting question, but I think we need to keep our eyes on the fact that Xi Jinping has really rebuilt the party in his image with his people. So there's virtually no pushback anymore. in-party deliberation. I think a lot of us thought maybe Lee could do that, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I know Mike or Jim, if we can like pull people in and have them give the answers I can't give, but I'd love to hear what they think.
Well, and we're getting some of that in the chat line. So John, I hope you can save this chat line to share down the road here, because I'm not getting through as many questions as I can. And there are some that kind of go on with comments about how is it possible for any country to believe that the US won't shove its values down others' throats when it consistently instigates regime change across the world. And how can anyone believe holds the aforementioned liberal values in the US when it selectively supports dictatorships, and has overthrown democracies in favor of dictatorships, e.g. Iran, etc.
Who asked that question?
This was an anonymous, which I don't usually read anonymous attendees' comments, but this kind of leads into another follow-up about India, which you mentioned earlier. Let's see. We may be willing to turn a blind eye to the sins of current dispensation in India, etc. Anyway, just comments about how do we balance these kinds of things.
Well, I wish the person who'd asked that question had told us their names, so I could say to them, like, oh man, your question's great. And your question is literally the question that haunts American politics since the end of World War II. And let me just go big picture before you answer the specific question. Think about 1944. And we've got a very clear world war on our hands in which you've got the Nazis on one side, Imperial Japan, and on the other side, you've got America and Britain and France. You've got democracies against dictatorships. And America goes into the war with these great 4 promises of freedom from Franklin Roosevelt. And if you go through the historical record and you see the kinds of letters that were coming to the White House in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt was like a god. And all around the world, people knew that America stood for democracy, good food, plentiful housing, and kicking some Nazi butt. And what's stunning is by 1947, maybe 1948, Truman has allied himself with Chiang Kai-shek, who's a dictator, instead of Mao, whom the people love. We're already in bed with France in Indochina, and that becomes the Vietnam War. In order to control the Suez Canal in the Middle East, we've already made alliances with dictators all across Northern Africa and the Middle East. And so one of the great tragedies of American history is to think we have this Rooseveltian vision of peace and democracy that crumbles after World War II into the horror of the Cold War. And so your question is, will anyone ever believe us if we say we're not going to shove our values down their throat? I mean, that's a great question, and it would be a hard thing to believe. That takes us back to the US State Department. We need to have leadership committed to democracy as a value, not as a justification for regime change. We need to be committed to free markets as a value, not as a reason to overthrow your economy, not to bring in shock therapy and destroy your indigenous production. And so America has gotten its foreign policy so wrong for so long that it would be hard for some parties to understand that we actually think we're doing this in the name of democracy. So your question is a great one. And for me, as a longtime progressive activist on the left, I mean, it's the thing that breaks my heart, to think that America is no longer something you believe in. And that when people see the American flag coming, their response is to run, right? Because there's probably a cruise missile behind it or a drone missile or something. So I think your question's a great one, that we've screwed ourselves by being dishonest brokers for too long.
Wow. I have a question from Willow Jung, and her question is, and it looks like this pertains to China. Large amount of workers are losing their jobs due to foreign companies moving out of China. What will the Chinese government do with these people who don't have jobs? Will they move them into the army?
Yeah, Willow, your question is really complicated. My family historically is from Detroit. I don't know what y'all know about Detroit, but Detroit in 1954, Detroit was the third largest city in America with the highest citizen income in America, right? Detroit was like this pro-union wonderland. Everybody had a job, everybody had a house, everybody voted Democrat. I mean, Detroit was just rolling. And then the auto industry moves to Mexico and Detroit becomes a third world war zone. This is what China fears above all else, is what happens when the manufacturing plants move to Vietnam and India. And for the first time in modern history, where we have a unemployment in China reaching a dangerous level. So first thing to know is that I don't think the Communist Party will let that happen. I think they will literally create businesses that they don't need. This is why the housing bubble in China is so huge, right? Because they're just building houses they don't need, but at least those people have jobs who are building the houses, right? So the Communist Party will juggle the market to create jobs, to prevent unemployment. All that's going to do is push the economic bubble farther down the road. And when that thing blows up, it's going to be really ugly in China. And so the question then is, yeah, do they put them in re-education camps? Do they draft them into the army? Do they try to retrain them? It's not clear what they will do, but that reckoning is coming, and it's coming very, very fast. So yeah, that's going to be, and again, to go back to one of your first questions, Jim, when that reckoning comes with rising unemployment in China at home, and when that leads to a bubble in dissatisfaction with the regime, that's when I think an invasion of Taiwan will be most likely to occur as a way of kind of satisfying the nationalist impulse. So I think domestic economics and international policy are intimately related.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. And before you go, if you want to make any announcement to us about what you're doing at the university with your students, what they might be pursuing in the future, any Zoom chats we should log into to see, other talks that you know about that are coming up. And I do know there's some others that we'll try to include in our next newsletter. So you have a little time to get back in touch if it's not handy today. But I'm not opposed to promoting talks like this wherever they happen, and simply say our former speaker is now appearing on another venue to continue this conversation, because this has been a really great one for us. And again, I want to thank you for coming to Portland. But anyway, I'll let you have a couple of final comments before we hit the 1:15 mark. And yeah, tell us what's going on out in your neck of the woods.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, John. Thank you, Derek and Tim, for having me. Thank you to the audience. Your questions have just been fantastic. I really appreciate all the feedback. I think you're all asking great questions, and I think you're doing amazing work with World Oregon and the Northwest China Council. Congratulations to all of you. And Jim, what I'd like to do, if I could, is I'm still in the process of nailing down a new round of summer conferences in China. But when we get those figured out, what I'd love to do is share that information with your groups and see if your people want to either fly to China to participate or to Zoom in and join us in that way. But I'd love to deepen our relationship more.
No, that's a great opportunity. And we have quite a few academics that are members of the organization and are attending today, for that matter, or retired academics, and may not want to get on an airplane, but they might want to join by online opportunities. But certainly send us information about upcoming conferences. I do get information about conferences that are being held in the United States. This would be very interesting to know that opportunities are opening up to go to China and do the things we did just a few years ago, And so I really look forward to getting that information and sharing it with our members.
Sure. And just one caveat, that plane tickets from the US to Beijing are still like, 10 grand. Right. So we're telling everyone to fly through Taipei, fly through Singapore, have to kind of take a circuitous route to get there.
Right. Well, Portland traditionally direct flights at least to Japan, and connecting flights onto China or Taiwan from there. And Seattle was supposed to have started or resumed some direct flights just last Friday on Delta to, I think, Shanghai, maybe Beijing. So I haven't followed up to see, how many of those flights actually took place, but they should be happening now. And hopefully the prices will come down in time for a summer trip to China.
Thanks, Jim. It's been great talking with you and your colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at another event online or in person here in Portland. And take care until we talk again
All
soon.
right, bye-bye.